everyone to this panel of the second annual Edinburgh Byzantine Book Festival. My name is Stephen Smith, and I'm delighted to present Mark Masterson, who will talk about his new book, Between Byzantine Men.Desire, Homosociality, and Brotherhood in the Medieval Empire, published by Routledge just last year. Mark is perhaps best known for his 2014 monograph, Man to Man, Desire, Homosociality, and Authority in Late Roman Manhood, which argued forcefully and persuasively for the presence of same-sex desire between elite Roman men in late antiquity, at the very moment when Roman law intensified its criminalization of sexual activity between males. That book, focused as it was on the writings of the Emperor Julian, Athanasius's Life of Antony, and the representations of emperors in the history of Ammianus Marcellinus, offered a startling and welcome conclusion that desire between elite Roman men was not only something visible and known, but indeed was widely accepted as a medium for expressing admiration and friendship. And desire between men could also enhance authority's power through demonstrations of penetrating observation and knowing discipline. One moment. If we ignore the erotic dimension in late Roman homosocial relations, then we will only ever have a partial understanding of a richer, more complicated, and infinitely more interesting reality of the world that elite Roman men shared together. Fast forward now more than 500 years to Byzantium in the 10th century. Mark's new book, Between Byzantine Men, isn't technically a sequel or a companion volume to Man, but Mark brings some of the same invaluable questions to the Middle Byzantine period. And his study presents itself as a kind of scholarly intervention, restoring the erotic dimension to Byzantine homosociality so that we may get a fuller picture of the life that elite men shared together in the Eastern Roman Empire. Mark's study ranges over epistolography, the historiographic tradition about the rise of the Emperor Basil I, the liturgical rite of adelphopiesis, or brother-making, and the infamous bachelorhood of the Emperor Basil II. It's an exciting read from beginning to end, and I confess that once I had made my way into the middle of the first chapter, I intentionally slowed down so that I could savor Mark's compelling reparative interpretations and the intertextual connections that he finds in the primary sources. The book is theoretically sophisticated, taking its cue from a growing body of scholarship that employs reparative interpretive strategies, and in this respect, Between Byzantine Men is indebted to the trailblazing works of theorist Eve Sedgwick and the historian Laura Doan. But Mark's approach is also unabashedly, even proudly philological, and his training as a classicist makes him expertly familiar with Byzantine paideia, that classicizing, rhetorical, literary, and philosophical curriculum that bound together the members of elite Byzantine society. Expressions of amorous affection between Byzantine men could be flagrant, as we will see, but these masters of the literary arts could also bring sophistication, nuance, and subtle allusion to their writing, and Mark's sensitive philological analyses make these subtleties come to vivid life. Mark's book shows us, among other things, that Byzantine men in the 10th century could write letters to each other with passionate ardor, and that such letters circulated without shame and without apparent recriminations for either the author or recipient. We also learn that masculine glamour and manly sex appeal could be valuable qualifications for advancement at the court of Michael III. This Byzantine emperor wanted to surround himself with ornaments of male beauty, and Basil I therefore knew the heights to which he could rise by leveraging his own beauty and desirability to other men. Furthermore, if I, for one, always suspected that Byzantine men could use adelphopiesis as the liturgical framework for bringing their mutual love for each other into the church, then Mark's book at last makes the case that this was not just a vague possibility, but in many cases the primary motivation for one man to make another man his brother in the eyes of God. Mark's book is sure to make an impact on scholars of Byzantium who work in the areas of gender and masculinity studies, but it also constitutes an important chapter in queer history. I recommend the book highly, and at this point, I'll hand things over to Mark so that he can tell us more about it.
Well, Thank you so much, Stephen, for those remarks. And thank you to Petros for organizing this event. I'm really pleased to take part in it. Between Byzantine Men is centered on the 10th century and takes as its focus men, many of whom we can assume knew each other or were at one degree of separation from each other. Adjacent to the court of Constantine VII, Bouras-Vallianatos, for the most part, these men built careers in the court and in ecclesiastical circles. They also wrote letters that provide documentation into how they perceived relations with one another. And what we discover when we read these letters by these highly educated men is a milieu of warm relations where discussions reveal comfort with same-sex desire between men. The presence of this desire and intimated carnality is intensified by our perception and interpretation of references to Holy Scripture and pagan literature, often in the same letter. But my book does more than draw a picture of these warm relations between Byzantine men in these letters. Our first surviving accounts of the rise of Emperor Basil I come from the pens of men who were in this milieu, quite likely including Simeon the Logothete and Theodorus Daphnapates, men whose letters figure earlier in the book. Their own experiences of 10th century homosociality leads them to imagine the 9th century rise of Basil I in terms that are familiar to them. And so we have accounts famous for their intimations of same-sex eroticism and for Basil I's brotherhoods that are given a desirous complexion. My book spends a great deal of time on 6 extant histories, drawing connections to the erotic language that is found in the letters, as well as analyzing the situations themselves and paying attention as well to allusions to sacred scripture and pagan literature. After these considerations in general of the 10th century accounts of the 9th century, the book moves to detailed discussion of ritual brotherhood, Basil I and the histories, and of the probable state of ritual brotherhood in the 10th century. An extended analysis of the ritual situation and of the language of a lengthy 10th century prayer reveals much man-to-man physical proximity and man-to-man closeness underlined and emphasized by scriptural allusions and the appearance of language that we've already seen in the letters. Ritual brotherhood was not a rite of marriage, of course, but it is a site of physical closeness, and what brothers may do and feel prior to the rite or afterwards is an open question. And some historians, of course, some historiographers in the 10th century felt that Basil and Nicholas, for example, had sex. The final chapter of the book goes forward in time to analyze Simeon, the new theologian's parable of an emperor who takes a rebel to bed. This is a notorious and sexy parable, and I argue it is a jibe against Emperor Basil II, who never wed and was famously an austere man's man, an austere military man. Simeon, whose frankness about sex between men is well known, had political reasons for being critical of Basil II. And given the nature of court culture demonstrated earlier in the book, his speaking of carnality in court circles is hardly surprising. I believe that he was revealing hypocrisy in the devout emperor. To speak in general of what I do in Between Byzantine Men, and to begin to conclude my remarks, I draw pictures of male homosociality in this book, that is, groups of men with a reparative lens. I'm using a reparative lens, rather than focusing on, say, legal and ecclesiastical condemnations of same-sex eroticism, which of course are part of the scene. I consider the evidence of same-sex eroticism and masculine closeness in the sources reparatively. And that means I think about what this desire and actions that flow from it would have accomplished for the men. And, to take some examples, it would, of course, brought them close together, obviously, but also, too, it would have eased social relations by identifying a symmetry of affection where there very well might be asymmetries of social status, for example. The conclusions of all of this are that this desire was present and we can see it, and that Byzantium was, like all places, a complicated place with differing perspectives on sexual desire. And truly, lastly, I am so happy to have put this book together, this book whose synthesis of evidence offers a way to understand this evidence of desire and homosociality in our sources. Now, I would very much love to answer questions and provide expansions where I can, and thank you all for your attention.